Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Goldster Inside Story. I'm thrilled to have with me today the author and podcaster, Caroline Crampton. We're going to be talking about her podcast, her journalism, this rather beautiful book, The Way to the Sea, and all sorts of other things to do with writing and being an author and podcaster. So, Caroline, welcome to Goldster.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us today. Now, I want to talk to you, first of all, about how you started your writing career. Did you always know that you wanted to be a writer? Was it something that you'd thought about since you were a child, or did it just kind of come upon you?
It was something I wanted to do when I was a child, but I think I convinced myself that it wasn't a viable job, that it was maybe something I could do in my spare time or for fun, but that, I don't know, whatever media I was consuming about it made it sound unobtainable as an actual job. So in my late teens, I was convinced I wanted to be a lawyer. So I did lots of work experience with barristers and so on, thinking that's the path I would follow. And then I did an English degree with a view to then doing a law conversion. But by the end of it, I thought, oh, actually, it seems like people do go on to be writers. There are training programs I can do to become a journalist. So that's the route I went instead. So journalism was really my entry into being a paid writer, as it were.
And when you first started working in journalism, did you have to specialize in anything? Did you just have to take whatever you could get? How did you get there?
So I did as much and varied experience as I possibly could. So I did lots of working at my local newspaper, which was, your classic local beat stories. So anything and everything. And then I did it was a master's degree in newspaper journalism. So I suppose that's a specialty in form, if not subject. But my first proper full-time job was at a magazine, the New Statesman magazine. And then I worked there on and off for, I think, 8 years. So that was my sort of first entry into it. It just happened that magazine, which is pretty much half politics and half culture, books and so on, fitted my personal interests very well. And so it turned out to be a good fit. But like a lot of these things, it was, I think, complete serendipity that's where I ended up.
And I had a look through your New Statesman kind of backlist, as it were. You had some really interesting articles and things in there. Do you have any interesting things from when you were working there? What were your favorite things to work on?
I think one of my favorite sort of periods there was I was there for the magazine Centenary in 2013, and we produced a special issue of the magazine for the actual week celebrating its founding, which had been about a year in the making. I and a couple of colleagues had spent a very long time going through the magazine's archive, which has some truly incredible stuff, which, because it had never been digitized before, I mean, we knew in principle that, say, George Orwell had written for the magazine and Beatrice Webb and Christabel Pankhurst, but we'd never gone through and looked and actually transcribed what they'd written.
Oh, that was so fascinating.
That was amazing. And later on, like Martin Amis had a film review column for a while when he was very young, first starting out. So we found all these amazing things. And there was some incredible stuff from. It was interesting as well to look at key points in history rather than looking at writers. So, what did the magazine write the week that the Second World War began, or what did they write during Suez? A lot of the time, those columns aren't bylined because that wasn't the tradition at the time. The political correspondent wouldn't be named, but you still got a sense of someone writing in the present tense about something that was so important. So I absolutely loved doing that. That was my favourite thing, I think.
That must have been really fascinating, because recently, I don't know if you've been listening at all on the BBC, but BBC Sounds have been going through the archives and finding things. And it's so intriguing to see, people who've now become really famous, kind of letters that they wrote when they were teenagers or whatever. And I find that kind of living history so fascinating.
Yes, it was really interesting to see. Sometimes when you look at those historical events, you can see someone really understanding what's the significance of this is going to be. So Suez was a good example of that. The writers really understood at the time how important that was. But at other points, they just didn't, because when you're in the trench, as it were, you can't see what's outside. And so there was some where I thought, oh, this political crisis is definitely going to yield an interesting piece. And then it just didn't.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because I guess if we look back in our own lives and see things that we've lived through, extraordinary moments of history, but at the time we may not have actually realized they were happening for a couple of days. Or I mean, I remember just very recently reading a novel that was set in lockdown. And I thought, do I really want to read a novel set in lockdown? You know, I've been there, I remember it. And I was stunned at how much I'd actually forgotten only from a couple of years ago. And so when you're reading something that's written kind of in real time, it is really fascinating to see those connections from the past. And has that helped you in your later writing, do you think, and in your podcasting?
I think so, yes. I think that experience of wading through vast amounts of material of all, it's very humbling to see, you know, these were the people who were doing what I was doing at the time. You know, they're working at this magazine, we had to get one out every single week, and so I suppose it was a good exercise in humility to know that it might feel vitally important to me what I'm doing, but actually people were doing this for 100 years and it always got done and it was always all right broadly in the end.
That is very true. So tell us, you're a podcaster as well. How did you get into podcasting?
So that also happened when I was at the New Statesman, actually. So I was an early podcast enthusiast as a listener. So I started listening to podcasts in about 2009. There was one particular one that the Times newspaper started doing that I was very keen on, a sort of political satire podcast called The Bugle. And I listened to that, and I listened to a couple of American ones. And then I think it was actually around that centenary in 2013 where we had a bit of extra money to spend on this kind of thing. And so I suggested that we start a podcast for the magazine. No one there had ever done it before. We didn't really have any expertise in it. So we were just sort of feeling our way. We recorded it in a broom cupboard. We were lucky to have a member of staff who was a very skilled musician. That was his hobby. So he was very good with microphones and so on. And so he lent us equipment and showed us how to do it. And it went really well. Readers really liked it. I really liked doing it. And so we added a few other podcasts at the magazine over the years. And then when I left, I decided I wanted to start my own one.
And so how did you go about doing that? Because I think a lot of people think, oh, I'm going to start a podcast. They've just got no idea where to go about it. Where did you go for advice, or did you just know how to after the New Statesman?
Well, so I had been very lucky to have 3-4 years at that point of sort of learning on the job. So that was definitely very helpful. And I'd also been lucky in that I was doing it in London, and where there were lots of other people doing the same things. And so I had ended up drifting into this de facto community of people who were doing this, facilitated by, there was and still is, there's a great Facebook group called, I think it's called Podcasters Support Group, where you could post any question and a dozen people would have a great answer for you straight away. So that was very helpful.
So tell us about your podcast, She Done It. What is the premise behind it, and what made you want to do that particular subject?
So the initial impetus to start it was the transition I was making at the time in life, where I was moving from being, you know, a full-time editor at a magazine to being a freelance writer. And having spent so many years essentially taking direction over what I had to do, I really wanted to do something that was just me making all the decisions, and whether it was good or whether it was bad, it was all my fault, as it were. And so I picked a topic, detective fiction from the 1920s, 30s and 40s, that was just a personal interest of mine, had been my whole life, because I felt like that was going to be most likely to have mileage for me in terms of wanting to keep doing it and also knowing about it and having an enthusiasm to share. And I just went from there, really. A friend of mine who was a podcaster of very long standing gave me a bit of advice, saying that no one will really listen to your first 10 episodes. You know, it takes a long time to build an audience for a podcast. So just do it, just start, and you'll get better as you go. Don't worry too much about making the first one perfectly good. And so I took that advice and just went for it, really. And it's still going. We just passed our 100th episode last month.
I was going to say, you've got over 100 episodes now, haven't you? So that's fascinating. And this is a subject that, you know, I think many of us here, I know that lots of people on Goldster really love kind of crime fiction, golden age. We've talked a little bit about it before. We had an Agatha Christie month in September. What is it you think that makes this period of crime fiction so perennially popular? You know, some of them it's 100 years on.
I think it's hard for us to understand now how incredibly exciting and popular the genre was at the time, that just so much was being published in especially sort of the early to mid 1920s, when people were really getting going. Publishers like Victor Gallant were just putting it out, you know, by the meter essentially. And so a lot of that has not really survived, in the same way with lots of books from other periods. Some stay in print, some don't, some get rediscovered and some don't. So I think part of it is that we're mostly reading the good stuff, the authors that have stayed in print.
Yeah.
I try as best I can to, pick up rarer stuff in secondhand bookshops or on eBay and so on. And it's extremely hit or miss. Some of it is good and some of it isn't. So we are getting the kind of cream of the crop in one sense, but also just, I think there's a formula and a comfort and a knowability about that style that you just keep seeking out. You're always happy to read another one, because although the plot will be different, there are certain elements that will be the same that you can be sure, and if you like that, you'll enjoy it.
Yes. Now I'm going to ask everybody here if they're interested, as I know some of you are, in golden age fiction, to put in some of your favorite titles and see whether Caroline knows about them, which I'm sure she will, because she's extremely knowledgeable. So Caroline, who are your favorites? I mean, do you have a particular favorite author from that time period, or a particular favorite book from that time period? That's really hard, I know, to ask for one.
Well, I'm a particular fan of Dorothy L. Sayers. She's my favorite writer from that period. And it's a bit of a blessing and a curse to be a fan of hers, because unlike, say, Agatha Christie, who carried on writing detective fiction, well into her 80s, and there were even a couple published after her death in the 70s. Dorothy L. Sayers wrote around a dozen detective novels between 1923 and I think 1937 was the last one, and then she stopped. So you don't have as much material to work with, but no, I really rate her and I think she's great. There are a couple of other writers who are a bit harder to get hold of the books of, who I'm still reading, but I really like. One is Anthony Gilbert, which was a pseudonym for Lucy Beatrice Malleson. And she went the other extreme to Sayers. Sayers has a very aristocratic and learned detective in Lord Peter Wimsey. Gilbert's detective is a lawyer, a sort of rough around the edges. You're never quite sure if he's on the side of right or not lawyer, but ultimately he gets the job done. So I like the contrast between those two. And Gilbert also writes in a style I think we would recognize a bit more now, as she edges on a sort of psychological thriller almost. There's a book of hers called The Woman in Red that I think you could probably publish it today, to be honest, with that title, and the premise of a girl who goes to take a job as a secretary and gets kidnapped and disappeared essentially by an unscrupulous woman with a nefarious plot. I think you could publish that today, to be honest, and it would probably chart.
You probably would. And so when you discover these writers who perhaps other people haven't heard, obviously not Dorothy L. Sayers, but when you discover more obscure ones, do you ever feel tempted to try and bring them back into publishing? Do you feel tempted to kind of republish their books if they're no longer available?
Well, I mean, this is something I kind of idly talk to my husband about sometimes. I think if I had time, I would start a publishing company. But luckily, people are already doing this. In the last 10 years or so, there's been a real movement. The British Library have their imprint, British Library Crime Classics, that are doing it. There's some smaller presses like Agora and Dean Street Press, and I think there's one called The Locked Room, and various ones that are doing this, either acquiring rights from estates or where things are out of print, just republishing them. So I've got a friend who's about 30 years older than me, who we talk a lot about this, and she says, you have no idea how hard it was to be a fan of these books. Even 20 years ago, you now can walk into Waterstones and buy them. It was never like that before.
Extraordinary. But I did love always going through secondhand bookshops and finding those, or particularly the Penguin crime ones. Yes. And their expensive jackets, which everybody else was after as well. But it's just such a thrill about discovering one that nobody's picked up for ages. And that, I think, is something that we've lost a lot of as secondhand bookshops have been kind of closing down. I used to always love that. When I was a student, just going in and finding them, feeling very nostalgic about it now. And I wonder whether they ever thought that would be the case, that all these decades on, new generations of readers would still want to read their work.
I don't think they did. I mean, Agatha Christie is actually a good example of that. She's someone who had a very long life and a very long career. And if you read in her autobiography, which she was writing towards the end of her life, although not absolutely at the end, that she expresses surprise that And she sort of goes back and assesses some of her earlier work, and she names the books that she thinks are good and the ones that she really doesn't think that she did well on. Her least favourite is one called The Mystery of the Blue Train. She says, wish I never wrote that. But she's surprised that anyone is still reading what she was writing in 1920, and she's writing from the vantage point of the late 50s.
Yeah. And why do you think it is that Agatha Christie is the one who is constantly turned into films and TV shows rather than the others? I mean, someone like Dorothy L. Sayers, she's barely ever, she's had a couple, Nio Marsh as well, couple, but most of them just don't. It's always Agatha Christie. Why do you think filmmakers don't take that chance on the others?
I find this to be an interesting question. I'm not sure I have a definitive answer to it, but I think it has to just be, at this point, sort of brand loyalty and name recognition that, although I think of as, say, Dorothy L. Sayers, Nio Marsh, Josephine Tey as kind of up there with Agatha Christie, in terms of commercial power, there's nothing like Christie. And that's partly the, steps she took during her lifetime to, she set up Agatha Christie Limited in the 50s.
Gosh, was it
and
that
it's partly, yes, well, that was partly a tax, she was having tax problems. I can go into detail about this if people are interested, but basically, before the Second World War, America didn't charge British authors tax on royalties that they earned in the States. Then after the Second World War, when they were very strapped for cash, they turned around and said, oh, actually, we'd like you to pay tax for all that time when we said you didn't have to. So
Wow.
Christie was slapped with this enormous tax bill, and she really struggled.
Yeah.
And the solution ultimately was to set up a company that then owned the copyrights to her novels, because then the tax situation was different and it was easier to resolve. But also just the quirk of circumstance, Christie had one child who had one child. So her estate has stayed very close to the tree, as it were. And they've also been very, savvy about how they've exploited it. Say Dorothy L. Sayers had one child who had no children. So there is no family. Her estate is now in the hands of a committee of lawyers who, they answer queries, but they're not interested in exploiting it. Tay, she had no children. So all these things mean that there's no one pushing or promoting. And then on the other side, Hollywood's thinking, well, the last Agatha Christie film did really well, so we'll just do another one.
Yeah. It is fascinating, isn't it? Because I'm a huge Agatha Christie fan, but I'm a fan of so many of these other writers, and it always frustrates me that you never get any adaptations of those, and quite often how difficult their work is to find. So when you first started doing She Done It, what were the first subjects that you wanted to cover? And by the way, everybody, I've put the link in the chat to the She Done It website so that you can find this, and you can also download it wherever you get your podcasts, I believe is the phrase.
Yes. So in approaching the podcast, there were a couple of things I knew I wanted to do with it. And one was a matter of form rather than subject, was that a lot of podcasts, especially 4 or 5 years ago when I was thinking about this, were like we're doing now, two people talking off the cuff. It's interesting. It's relatively easy to do. What I wanted to try and do was different to that, which was a scripted podcast. So almost like a short chapter of a book, even, or a section of an audiobook. And you can include music, you can include, so I do interview people and then I use them almost like quotations. I insert them into the script that I'm then recording. So I wanted to do it in that style because I just felt that was it was something a bit different, something that not all podcasts do, because it does take more work and more skill to do. And also just I felt it suited the subject matter better, because there was no way I was going to be able to remember all these dates and quotations and facts off the top of my head. But if I could write it beforehand, then that'd be better. Also, I'm a writer really more than a broadcaster, so I felt more comfortable there. So that was my starting point. So then I was looking for subjects within my niche that I felt would welcome that treatment. So I tried to think mostly thematically. So rather than saying, let's talk about Agatha Christie, that's an enormous topic. Rather, I would try and slice it right down and go, well, let's think about, so an episode I did a while ago, Agatha Christie's archaeology, just characters. She had this period of her life through her second husband where she was spending half the year out in the Middle East on archaeological digs, and it really makes it into her work. She has one novel that's explicitly set on an archaeological dig. She has several others where, she has Poirot traveling out to Jordan and various things. So narrowing it right down, making that circle very tight, means that I think then I can make something hopefully interesting and informative in about 25 minutes. And I can be very specific without feeling like I've got this huge edifice to try and tackle.
So what kind of guests do you target? I mean, you've had some wonderful guests on your show. Who do you look for? Do they come to you, or do you spend your time going, oh, who am I going to ask on next?
It's a real mixture of the two, actually. As the podcast has been going longer, I do get people, either proposing themselves, saying, I've done a piece of work on this and we'd be interested to talk to you about it, or, publishers saying we've got a book coming out about this. But a lot of the time, yes, it's just, it works the other way around. I decide I would like to do an episode about X subject. I go and look for who knows about this, who has an interesting perspective on it. And I also try very much to sort of mix things up, because the classic thing in podcasting, especially today, which I'm sure everyone who listens will have noticed, a lot of podcasts these days are celebrities interviewing other celebrities. And the reason for that is that both people come with a baked-in audience and a following, meaning that it's a great way to grow your podcast, that people will come and listen to that particular episode because you've got a guest that they like, and then maybe they'll stay for future episodes. So I do occasionally, look for a high-profile guest if they speak to a topic that I'm covering. So I've had Lucy Worsley. I've had a few people like that who've got a kind of existing following. But then most of the time I go completely the opposite, and sometimes I'm interviewing an academic who's never been interviewed before in their life, just because they've written this one book or this one paper that is about this thing I want to know about.
And that's what's so great, because I really like She Done It. And I think what's great is you have a really good variety of guests, and they've always got something really interesting to say. So I can thoroughly recommend to people to listen to She Done It. It's a really good podcast. So let's get on. Actually, I've got one question here. Which is your favourite book by Dorothy L. Sayers?
I think it is Gaudy Night, which is 1935. It's a mystery set in a women's college at Oxford.
Yeah, it's a really good one, and it's quite fascinating. I remember the first time I read it, it's one I've reread a couple of times, and just thinking, what a great slice of social history it was to give us the idea of women's education at that time, which was still the absolute elite.
That's part of why I love it, because as a mystery, it's probably not her best, and it's definitely not the best, but just for the atmosphere and the interaction of the characters and all the little things that you learn. Like, for instance, I love the bit about how the generation of young women who were attending this college in the 1930s are, the Dons say, very different to the ones a generation before. The 1930s girls, they don't feel quite so grateful that they've been allowed into the university. They're much more confident of their place in education, and therefore they are a bit slacker and a bit sort of more casual about it. Whereas they're saying, we were so aware that we were only just got a foot in the door. We were grateful to be allowed to do everything.
Yes, it is. It's really intriguing to see how, the real life of that time. I think that's one of the great things about Golden Age fiction, is so good at social history. As a historian, reading crime fiction for some reason seems to be more honest about everyday life than other forms of fiction. Perhaps other forms of fiction, other novels are trying to be too kind of highfalutin, I don't know. But there really is such an incredible amount to learn from crime fiction about the way that people lived in general. Got another question here. Are you a fan of Nancy Spain? She's a novelist I've just discovered. I actually still haven't read much Nancy Spain, so I can't.
I wouldn't describe, I don't think I could describe myself as a fan, because I've only read 2 novels by her, but I've enjoyed both of them. And yes, so I'm interested to learn more, but I like what I've read so far, definitely.
Yeah. Well, that's what's so great. You think you've read all of these, and then you discover there's lots of new things. So let's talk about your new book, your book, The Way to the Sea. So tell us about this. This is the histories of the Thames, or the forgotten histories, I should say, of the Thames estuaries, which is a really great idea. So tell us about how that came about.
So this is a complete divergence from the crime fiction stuff. The two don't really interact at all. But so this is a book that came out in 2019, and that I've been working on for about 5 years before then. And it grew out of the fact that I grew up on the Kentish coast of the Thames estuary, and also had this, I think, slightly unusual experience where my parents aren't from Britain originally, they're from South Africa, and they came to England in a boat that they had built themselves. They sailed up from South Africa all the way into the Thames estuary, and through various quirks of circumstances, originally they were just here on a kind of career break, and ultimately they decided to stay, have family here, and that's how I came to be born there. And through complete chance, they ended up staying in the Thames estuary, originally on the Isle of Sheppey, then in Chatham, and ultimately they now live a bit further south in Kent. But they kept their boat, and so I grew up sailing every weekend, every holiday in the Thames estuary, and a few places that you can get easily from there. We did a lot of going across the North Sea to Holland and back and that sort of thing. And, I loved it there. I grew up loving it. But it wasn't until I was older and I went to university in Oxford and then I moved to London that I realised that most people didn't really know what happened to the Thames after it left London. There was not much kind of cultural conception of it. And B, if they did, they viewed that area very negatively. It was seen as an area of, great poverty, deprivation, of being very ugly as a landscape. It's very flat and muddy and so on. And this was so completely at odds with my own personal view of this place as, a wonderful playground and place that I'd grown up, a beautiful place to sail and so on. So that's really where the idea for the book came from, was to try and understand why there was this contrast and what could I do to try and introduce people to my idea of it.
And do you still love sailing? Do you do a lot of sailing now, or is that something that was from the past? Oh, now, I don't know if I've frozen or Caroline's frozen.
Hello there, Caroline. Are you still with us? This is Daniel. I think we've lost Caroline. If you just bear with me 1 second, I'll restart her connection.
We
have her
back.
back.
I'm back again.
Excellent.
Sorry, my Wi-Fi just dropped out for a second.
I didn't know if that was me or you. Sorry. So I was thinking.
No, it was me. The thing started flashing suddenly.
Sorry.
I'm sorry about that, everyone.
That's fine. I was just asking, are you still a very keen sailor? Do you still sail a lot?
I don't sail very much these days because I don't have a boat myself, but my parents still do it. So whenever I can join them, I do. They have been, they have not outgrown their taste for long distance sailing to other continents. So they've actually just in the last couple of weeks finally got their boat back from America, where it's been for the last 5 years. The pandemic obviously slightly put a pause on that enterprise, but they did this big journey across the Atlantic, up the east coast of America into the Canadian lake system, all down the Canadian coast. Wow. Then finally they got it back to Britain about 3 weeks ago. So yes, it's still very much in the family. It's still very much a preoccupation, but I don't have a boat myself, so I'm not doing it all the time.
So tell us about this book. Tell us about the histories of the Thames estuary. So as you say, most people just have no idea. What can you tell us that will intrigue us all?
Well, I think first and foremost, I think it's a really interesting landscape, just from an aesthetic point of view. So I always recommend that if people are able, if they're in the area, it's worth, taking a trip out to somewhere like the Hoo Peninsula and doing a walk for a day or something, because it really is so. When you're out there, it's very, very difficult to imagine that, Tower Bridge is just, 25 miles inland, that you're so close to London and all of the iconic river scenery, and you're suddenly in this completely different world. And it's ecologically really interesting. There's a lot of, wading birds, migrating birds, interesting fish and so on that spawn there. So from that point of view, I think it's also well worth a visit if you're interested in bird watching. There's lots of marshy land that's ideal habitat for that kind of thing. So there's all of that. There's also, very strong maritime links and history there. So I grew up very near the Chatham dockyards. Obviously, very important naval stuff. More recently, there's these extraordinary Second World War anti-aircraft defences in the Thames estuary, because I'm by no means a historian of the Second World War, but I think what the Luftwaffe were doing in the early 1940s was they were coming north from Germany until they hit the Thames, and then they were turning left and they were going straight into London. And so the solution to this was to try and shoot down these planes before they got inland. And so these extraordinary, I mean, they're an engineering marvel, these structures. They look like, imagine a box on a tripod, but the box is big enough to fit 30 people in it.
Wow.
And
Yes.
there are 7 of them in a circle, and they're just out on a sandbank in the middle of the Thames estuary with the incredible concrete technology that was able to sink these piles in to hold them up. And they had anti-aircraft guns on top of them, and they would be manned by a patrol, people living out there, and they would try and bring down the planes before they could get in to bomb London. And there were, I think, 2 rings of these, Red Sands Towers and Shivering Sands, and they're still there. They are now, they've been just sort of left there. I always think the difference between some other, major sites of Second World War interest, the Churchill bunkers in London, and they're a major tourist attraction and all this kind of thing, and the towers are just sitting out there gradually rusting and falling into the sea. But as I found when I was writing the book, there are some major local enthusiasts who try and keep interest alive, try and fundraise and so on to tell people about this. So there's all kinds of little things like that. There are shipwrecks. There's a lot of literary associations. I'm sure you know about the Dickens associations and so on. So yes, all these different things I wanted to pull together into one place where people could access it all. So that's how the book came about.
And I was thinking, it's because it's such a vast area. How did you begin with your research? I mean, where did you know that you wanted to go to? Was there anywhere exciting that somebody told you about that you'd not thought about before?
Yes. So, I mean, I'm working on a new book now, and so this is my second experience of having this. I find with a book project, there's always a point at which I go, it's too big, there's too much. I cannot possibly make one book out of this. How could anyone do this? And the advice I got from my very wise editor the first time, and she's had to say it to me again, is that you can only write your book. So you are not writing the only book about the Thames Estuary, you're writing your book about it. So plot your journey through this material and include the things that touch your story and that you're interested in. And the rest is for somebody else to write about, or for someone else, for you to write. With the Thames Estuary book, it became an actual physical journey. That was the best way to do it. So it begins at the source of the Thames and it ends where the estuary meets the sea. And part of that was I did that on foot or on train. Part of it was on my parents' boat when we were able to. And so I spent a long time with maps and with my dad, who's a big expert in this, working out the journey that we could do, and then the stories that kind of adhered to those points. And so that's how it came together in the end. Because yes, there is far too much, essentially.
Yeah, but where did you kind of physically go? Did you find good archives or anything like that, or was it talking to all kind of local people about oral history?
So yes, there was definitely some of that, talking to people. I was lucky that both because I had grown up on the Kent side, and also my dad's an engineer, and he worked at the port at Sheerness for a very long time and was very involved in the sort of community of people there. So there were lots of people involved with the river who were either family friends or professional connections of him. So that was very easy to get hold of people. And then also I don't think there's one specific archive, but I did find the National Art Library at the V&A very, very useful, actually, because I found I really wanted to get into sort of visual representations of the estuary, because I felt like, as I say, it just wasn't really seen. You couldn't really see it, and the staff there were very, very helpful in finding things about it. Some of Turner's work going out on the river in little boats to do sketches and so on was really interesting to learn about. And then in general, it was wading through a vast amount of material about the Thames to fill it out the bits that were about the estuary. And I generally found, actually Peter Ackroyd's great book about the Thames is a really good example of this. It's an enormous book, it's like this thick, and the last 5 pages are about the estuary. He goes in such incredible detail all the way up to about Woolwich, and then he has this little epilogue called Downriver, and then that's everything else. So I wanted my book to be the reverse of that. Mm-hmm. in the writing process, the first chapter was very troublesome because I basically tried to cover the whole distance that, say, Ackroyd does in about 400 pages in one chapter, so that I could begin at the point when he stops, as it were. So yes, that was a bit difficult. The first chapter was very long in first drafts and had to be cut and cut and cut and cut so as to make space for all the rest.
We've actually had a question here about the boat. What sort of a boat is it? And I think they want a recommendation of what sort of boat to buy. I don't know if you can...
What sort of boat? Oh, well, so the boat that they sailed, that I talk about in the book, which is the boat that they sailed from South Africa to Britain. I'm afraid I don't know the make or name, because they essentially bought an empty fiberglass hull, 33-foot long, one mast, and fitted it completely themselves. They built it from there. So I don't think it really has a make or type. It's just the boat. They sold that boat about 20 years ago. She is still active. The guy who owns her wrote to me when the book came out saying, I think this is my boat. And he has a copy of the book which he keeps in the boat, which I think is very nice. And they bought a new boat at that time because they wanted something a bit bigger, a bit more comfortable, a bit more suited to being slightly older. And it's a Naiad 380, which is a Swedish boat. I think it's built near Gothenburg. So that's what they're sailing now.
Brilliant, thank you. I hope that's helpful for whoever's looking to buy a boat. So you talked about the fact that you've got a new book, and we've already had a question. You're working on a new book. Tell us what it's about, and what is hypochondria is the question.
Okay, so the book I'm working on at the moment is titled A Body Made of Glass, and it is about hypochondria, which is a very big word with lots of ancient associations. The modern synonym for it, if you go to a doctor now, they would probably call it health anxiety. It's essentially, it covers a largish umbrella of different manifestations of this, but broadly it is being over anxious about your health and believing that you have medical conditions that doctors can't actually detect in you, and generally being fixated on the idea that you are not well when all the evidence points to the fact that you are in fact well. So that's the tension that the new book is about, really.
And how are you starting for the research with that?
Well, it's been very different to the first book, because with the first book, the problem was that there is so much written about the Thames. It's a paper river, essentially. There is a vast quantity of stuff that's been written about it over the centuries. With hypochondria, I have yet to find a single book that is just about it. The research has been the inverse of the first time, really, that I am things in all different subject areas and from all different places and times, looking for the little bit of reference or the little bit that I can then take forward into my book. So it's where the first one was more a challenge of distillation. This one feels more like a kind of a scavenger hunt where I'm out in the world looking for any reference to it. So yes, so I've been doing all kinds of recently I've been exploring the sort of the transmission of medical knowledge, and how we got from sort of Hippocrates and ancient Greek medicine to the early stirrings of the Royal Society and science and so on. And that's taken me into a whole diversion into North African and Middle East and medical scholars and all this sort of that stuff. So I would have, when I started this project, I had no idea that.
So what began your interest
in hypochondria? Well, very personal, really, that when I was 17, I was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is a kind of blood cancer. So I spent about 4 years being a part-time student and part-time cancer patient. And I was eventually cured when I was about 22, but the worry that it was coming back has stayed with me ever since. I think anyone who's had a serious illness like that will know what I mean. And periods where I think that every small rash I have is evidence that I'm headed back to the chemo ward, and then I have periods where it doesn't bother me at all. But that was sort of the interest, where the interest started, was firstly, I was just looking for, I suppose, fellow travelers, really. The idea that other people had been through this, that this was something that had existed in literature and in culture and so on. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized that hypochondria or health anxiety or a dissenting belief in the power of medicine has been there the entire time that medicine has existed. There have been doctors, there have been people going to them saying, but I think you're wrong about this. I think I am ill. And so that's where it came from, really.
Yeah. And have you asked other people who identify as hypochondriacs, do they actually call themselves that? Or have you kind of talked to people about their anxieties?
Yes, I'm in the process of doing that now. I'm doing a lot of Zoom with people, and there's a vast array of different experiences, really. Some people are almost proud or a bit defiant to identify themselves in that way. Other people look at it completely differently and say, well, I was right. You know, I was always worried about getting X, and then I did. So I was right to be worried about it.
Yes.
And then there are other people who, you know, I spoke to one person, an incredible story where she's a twin, and her twin had a whole variety of childhood illnesses that required a lot of hospitalization and physical therapy and so on. She's a completely healthy twin, but she imbibed a lot of anxiety that she would develop these same things because, you know, we are the same. We are the same in so many ways. So, you know, everyone has a different way into it, I'm learning, but they often ultimately end up in the same place.
And so how much longer have you got working on this book? When can we expect it to come out?
So the manuscript is due next year, and then it's currently slated for sometime in 2024. So I don't know more specifically than that, but that's currently the plan.
Well, talking back about The Way to the Sea again, we've had a comment from the person who asked about the boat saying, thank you very much. And they've recently read a book called More Drifting Than Rowing, about a trip down the River Wye in a dinghy. I don't know if you know that one. And they say
I don't know.
They're very much looking forward to reading your book as well. So
thank you very much.
I will actually put the link into the chat. So you mentioned a little bit earlier when you talked about your podcast, you talked about having interviewed Lucy Worsley, and I believe that you've actually been on her TV show and you're on it tonight. Is that right, that you were filmed for it?
That's right. Yeah, so Lucy has got this new biography of Agatha Christie that came out in the last couple of months, and she's done a 3-part TV series about Christie to go with it, and which has been on the last 2 Fridays, the final installments on BBC Two tonight. And so I'm in that one talking about Miss Marple.
Brilliant. And so what was that experience like?
It was really fun, and it was great to get to go. We filmed it down in Devon, very near Christie's house, Greenway, and it was the first incredibly hot day this summer, if you can cast your minds back from the Arctic snap we're having at the moment.
I'm so cold right now, I can't even think about heat, but yes, I do remember it was hot.
It was incredibly hot. And as it happens, I was staying in Cornwall to Devon to take with me because I was concerned that if I left him in the house, he would get too hot. So I took him with me. A junior production assistant on the TV show had to become dog minder for the day, which she was very enthusiastic about. Yes. And so the dog being given water at all times. And Lucy and I filmed our bit they'd borrowed a very, very picturesque little cottage for the day in a village called Dittisham, which is just above the River Dart, which a cottage that looked like it might be inhabited by Miss Marple. And so we pretended to have tea for the afternoon and talked about Miss Marple while they filmed various bits of it.
Brilliant. So I think if anybody wants to watch that is on iPlayer. I think it's actually already on iPlayer, isn't it?
It's all on iPlayer. They put all 3 episodes up at the same time when the first one went out, and then it's actually on television this evening.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. If you wouldn't mind staying there just one moment while I tell everyone what's coming up, and then we will come back to you in a moment, Caroline. So just to let everybody know what's happening on Goldster. So I'm back again next Thursday, and I'm interviewing, this is another Agatha Christie theme, actually, I'm interviewing Mark Aldridge, whose publications include the books Agatha Christie's Poirot, The Greatest Detective in the World, and Agatha Christie on Screen. He's a television as well as kind of crime writer, and he's an academic. And he's going to be really fascinating talking about his books. And then on Friday next week, Humphrey is back with Alex Shaw, an internationally best-selling author of thrillers starring Aidan Snow and Jack Tate. And they've also been taken from his own career, which is going to be, again, equally fascinating. And then on Thursday the 22nd, Humphrey is interviewing Samir Gray, who I think many of you have got to know quite well, on Goldster, talking about healthy aging and how to make the most of life in your 60s, 70s and beyond. And then I'll be back on the 23rd of December talking to Jeremy Seal about his biography of St. Nicholas. You may remember that I spoke to Jeremy last year about his travel writing and that he's an expert on Turkey. And of course, there's a connection with Turkey and St. Nicholas. So we're going to be talking about that, very Christmassy themed. And just to remind you that this month's book of the month is Breakfast at Tiffany's by Truman Capote, which Humphrey will be hosting on the 30th of December. So do make sure that you get the chance to read that before you join that. And now we've got a comment here, Caroline, about podcasts. And we have a comment here that says, do you think podcasts are the way ahead? Meaning people are now more aware of conservation or environmental issues, for example, so that a time will come when fewer books are printed. What do you think about that?
So I definitely think that podcasts are very good at spreading awareness of subjects. And I think, so a podcast that I really like to listen to that I think does a really good job of this is Reasons to be Cheerful, which is the podcast that Ed Miliband does with Jeff Lloyd. Ed Miliband turns out to be, I think, a better podcaster than he was a leader of the Labour Party. And they interview experts in different fields with a very strong focus on the environment. So I learn loads from that all the time that I don't think I would have encountered just out in the world elsewhere. As to whether podcasts will eventually mean fewer books are printed, I don't know. I feel like the last couple of years have demonstrated, publishing has really bounced back. There was I remember a time, 10 years ago, where everyone was prophesying that ebooks would replace print books and that there would be that sort of crossover and transition, and that's just not happened at all. So the book has been surprisingly resilient, and I think it will continue to be so.
Oh, I hope so. Yes, I do remember when they were prophesying the end of the real book and the ebooks were taking over. And then there was a kind of a rich peak in them, wasn't there? And then it kind of went back and people started buying real books again. I read both, and I listen to audiobooks and podcasts as well. So I think there's definitely a place for all of them. But I do hope that books survive, because let's face it, when you're traveling and your Kindle runs out of power, you can still always read an actual book. And I think that's always going to be they'll have that edge over them.
I had that exact thing happen I had a terrible train transport disaster on Wednesday, where a journey that should take 2 hours ended up taking 8. And there was a certain point, and I was, enjoying listening to my audiobooks and sort of weathering the delay that way. And then there was a certain point when I realized, I don't have a charger with me. So at a certain point, my phone's going to run out of battery. So it was like, right, turning it off, switching to my book.
Absolutely.
And that seemed like the sensible thing to do.
Yes. So much as I want us to be much more aware of the environmental emergency, I do hope that books are something we can still keep reading, because they give such joy. And look at this beautiful book. Here we are. Gorgeous. Look at that, proper paper and everything. We have a comment here for everybody on Goldster. Breakfast at Tiffany's is available free on Audible if you're an Amazon Prime or Audible member. So thank you very much for sharing that, Sue. That's really helpful. So for everybody who's looking to join Humphrey for the book of the month, please do read or listen to Breakfast at Tiffany's. And if you've seen the film, that's great. That'll be a rich discussion as well. But of course, the book is quite different from the film, which I think is really fascinating in itself. So Caroline, before we finish, just tell those of us here, and as many people on Goldster who I know are doing the Goldster Creative Writing course and are working on their own writing, what is your kind of writing routine? Have you found, you may not have a routine, have you found kind of tips that you could share with us, or your best way for getting the work done?
So I think there are two things that I have come to use. I think I am personally very susceptible to the idea that if I just find the perfect notebook or the perfect writing program or the perfect chair, suddenly the writing will happen in a magical way. And I constantly have to remind myself that no, there is no perfect way. There is only the way. I had an editor at a magazine I worked at once who was very fond of saying that the article that exists is better than the article that doesn't exist. So for all your, sitting there fretting and planning and worrying about it being perfect, if you haven't written anything, then there's nothing there. The imperfect article that you've actually written is automatically better than in your head. So I try and remember that all the time, that just put something down, get started. You can always improve it afterwards, but if you don't start, then you can never improve.
Very good
So
advice.
definitely that.
Yes, you cannot edit a blank page, so you have to get it down.
Exactly. And you also can't get help, so if you want an editor or a colleague or a friend or something to give, they can't help you until you actually do it.
Right.
So that's very important for me to remember at all times. And then kind of related to that is that I have realized over the years that I only really can do about 2-ish hours of good writing in a day. As much as I might like to think that I could just sit there and charge through the whole day, there's just at a certain point I just run out of steam, and then I just sit there moving words around and I'm not really achieving anything. So I find it's best to get my 2-3 hours as the first thing I do. So I try not to get sucked into doing emails or other bits that go with my job, or recording or whatever, and I just write. And then all of that, I can use my slightly bored, depleted brain to do all those other things. But if I keep putting the writing off all day, I will either never get to it, or I will get to it when I'm tired and hungry at 5 p.m. and it therefore won't happen. So I try to give kind of the best of my brain to it first thing, and then everything else can come after.
Brilliant, thank you. And we've just had a comment saying what an inspiring interview, so thank you very much for that.
Oh, thank you.
Now, before we do say goodbye, I know there's one more thing we haven't talked about, which I think you've got there to show, your map of Agatha Christie's England. Can you just tell us about?
Oh, right, yeah, so this is something I can open it up and show you if you want. This is something that came during the pandemic, actually. A very small independent publisher called Herb Lester got in touch to say that we're fans of the podcast and they would quite like to. They make these literary themed maps. They've got lots of them, so they've done like Raymond Chandler's Angeles, and there's one that I think is sort of espionage, famous spy sites in London. They do all kinds of things like that, and they wanted to do one about Agatha Christie. So they said, would you research and write? So it looks like that. But then on the back is all of this stuff that I wrote about all of the important locations in England to do with Agatha Christie's novels and so on. So that was a really fun lockdown project for me, to spend all my time vicariously traveling to these places and putting it all in the map.
Brilliant, thank you so much. It's called Agatha Christie's England. I think it's fairly widely available, and it's a very beautiful present if you're looking for a present for someone. As we know, Christmas is almost upon us. So thank you very much, Caroline, and for everybody for coming along, and have a lovely weekend. Take care, and I will see you all soon. And Caroline and I will now turn off our videos, but I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye.
Thank you very much for having me.